In 1980, four nuns from a small town in Northern California mysteriously disappeared without a trace, leaving their close-knit community engulfed in grief and unsettling speculation. But 28 years later, the priest makes a shocking discovery, revealing the horrifying truth about what really happened to them. Morning light filtered through the stained-glass windows of St. Agnes of Mercy Catholic Church, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the polished wooden pews. Father Elias Morrow stood at the altar with a solemn, yet steady voice as he concluded the memorial service. "May the souls of the departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace," he intoned, making the sign of the cross before him. "Amen," the congregation responded in unison. Father Elias looked out at the gathered faces, many elderly, some middle-aged, and a few younger parishioners. All had come together on this somber day to remember the four nuns who had vanished without a trace exactly 28 years ago. The mystery had haunted the small town of Eldon Hollow in Northern California for nearly 3 decades. As the service ended, Father Elias made his way to the church entrance, greeting each member of the congregation as they left. Many offered their condolences, though after 28 years, the words had taken on a ritualistic quality more than conveying the raw emotion of fresh grief. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Harmon," said Father Elias, clasping the elderly woman's wrinkled hands in his own. "Your presence means a lot." "I always come, Father," she replied, her eyes shining with held-back tears. "I can still remember Sister Mildred teaching catechism to my children. Such a gentle soul." Father Elias nodded, feeling the familiar pang of sorrow. Sister Mildred Hayes had been 68. When she disappeared, a lifetime of service to God cut short by whatever tragedy had befallen her and the other 3 nuns. One by one, the parishioners left, each carrying a different memory of the missing women. Sister Mildred Hayes, 68, Sister Joan Keller, 65, Sister Beatriz Enamora, 28, and the youngest, Sister Teresa Morrow, 23. For Father Elias, the wound was deeper. Sister Teresa had been his biological sister, and her disappearance had shaken his faith to its very foundation. When the last member of the congregation had gone, Father Elias slowly made his way back through the now empty church. His footsteps echoed in the silence as he walked toward his private office at the back of the building. The space was modestly furnished with a simple desk, a bookshelf filled with theological texts, and a window overlooking the church cemetery. At last alone, Father Elias sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The composed facade he maintained for his parishioners crumbled, leaving only a man consumed by grief and unanswered questions. "Why, Lord?" he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I have served you faithfully all these years. My sister dedicated her life to you. Why haven't you led me to them? What lesson am I failing to learn from this trial?" Tears slipped through his fingers as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. He rarely allowed himself this moment of weakness, but the anniversary always stripped away his carefully constructed defenses. After several minutes, Father Elias took a deep breath and wiped his eyes. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a small wooden box. Inside were several photographs, lovingly preserved despite the passage of years. The first was of Teresa on the day she took her final vows. Her young face beamed with joy and purpose beneath her veil, and Father Elias felt both pride and a sharp pang of guilt as he looked at the image. He had been the one to nurture her faith, to encourage her calling. He could still remember their conversations when she was just 16, her eyes alight with conviction as she spoke of her calling. "I was so proud of you," he whispered to the photograph. "I still am." The thought that had haunted him for 28 years crept into his mind again. If he hadn't encouraged her religious vocation, would she still be here today? Would she be a mother, a teacher alive and well instead of, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," Father Elias said sharply, making the sign of the cross to banish the treacherous thought. He couldn't allow himself to question God's plan, not even in his darkest moments. Setting aside the photo of Teresa, he reached for another. The last known image of the 4 missing nuns. They were sitting together on a wooden bench outside the small and remote chapel of St. Dymphna, near the edge of the Shasta Trinity National Forest. Sister Mildred and Sister Joan, the eldest, sat with their hands peacefully folded in their laps, their wrinkled faces serene. Sister Beatrice sat beside them, her posture more relaxed but her expression reverent. And next to her was Teresa, the youngest. Her eyes sparkled with purpose, even in the faded photograph. The photograph had been taken by a local visitor just days before the nuns disappeared. They had traveled to the chapel of St. Dymphna for a brief spiritual retreat, 2 days of fasting, prayer and silence before the feast of a Catholic saint. The diocese had also tasked them with assessing the condition of the old chapel to determine whether it should be restored or dismantled. Sister Therese, with her eye for detail, had been entrusted with documenting the state of the structure. Father Elias stared at the image, his mind drifting to calculations he had made countless times before. Sister Mildred would be 96 now, Sister Joan 93. Even if by some miracle they had survived whatever happened, they would now be frail, elderly women. But Beatrice would be 56 and Teresa just 51, still potentially in the prime of life. He remembered the frantic days and weeks after their disappearance. The police had thoroughly searched the forest, combing through underbrush and scaling the slopes of nearby mountains. Search parties had spread out across farms, villages, and surrounding towns, but not a single clue had emerged. No scraps of clothing, no personal belongings, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the 4 women had simply vanished into thin air. The official theory eventually settled on a bear attack. The Shasta Trinity National Forest was known for its wildlife, including black bears, which could become aggressive if they felt threatened. Perhaps the sisters had wandered too deep into the woods and encountered a predator. But the complete absence of evidence had always made this explanation feel hollow to Father Elias, and to many others as well. Over the years, uglier rumors had circulated, whispers that the nuns had abandoned their vows and run away to start new lives. Father Elias and the church had worked tirelessly to silence such speculation, but the seeds of doubt had been planted in the community nonetheless. Teresa would never have done that, he whispered, tracing his sister's face in the photograph. She would never have left without telling me. As he continued to gaze at the photo, his eyes drifted toward the chapel in the background. St. Dymphna had been a simple structure built in the 1920s to serve the scattered Catholic population of the area. Its white walls and modest bell tower were visible behind the nuns, surrounded by the towering trees at the forest's edge. Something tugged at Father Elias's heart as he studied the building. He hadn't visited St. Dymphna in over 20 years, finding the memories too painful to bear. But now, on this anniversary, he felt a strange urge to see it again, to walk where his sister had walked, to pray where she had prayed. Perhaps it was mere sentimentality, a desire to feel close to Teresa on this difficult day. Or, perhaps, a small voice whispered at the back of his mind, there was still something left to discover. There's some clue overlooked in the initial investigation. That last thought was almost certainly nonsense. What could possibly remain to be found after 28 years? And yet, the pull was undeniable. Father Elias carefully returned the photographs to the box, except for the one of the 4 nuns at St. Dymphna, which he slipped into his pocket. He rose from his desk, picked up his Bible and rosary, and left his office with determination in his step. In the church parking lot, he slid behind the wheel of his modest sedan, placed the photograph on the passenger seat beside him, and said a brief prayer for guidance. Then he turned the key in the ignition and drove away from St. Agnes, heading toward the forest and the ghosts of his past. The winding road from Eldon Hollow to the Shasta Trinity National Forest carried Father Elias through shifting landscapes. The town's neat houses and businesses gave way to scattered farms, which eventually surrendered to encroaching wilderness. Tall pines and cedars crowded the road. Their shadows dappled across the asphalt as he drove. The journey took about an hour and a half, giving Father Elias plenty of time to reflect. He found himself remembering the many times he had made this very trip in the weeks following the nun's disappearance. Back then, His car had been filled with missing person posters bearing Teresa's face, and his heart had been held up by desperate hope. Now he carried only memories and a resigned acceptance of the mystery that had shaped his life. As the road narrowed and began to climb into the hills, Father Elias slowed the vehicle. The chapel of St. Dymphna had been situated in a small clearing near the edge of the forest, accessible by a modest dirt path that branched off from the main road. He scanned the roadside, searching for the familiar turn-off. When he reached what he believed to be the correct location, Father Elias frowned in confusion. Instead of the simple dirt path he remembered, he found a paved private road blocked by an ornate gate. A no trespassing sign was posted alongside smaller notices warning of private property. "This can't be right," he murmured, pulling his car over to the side of the road. He consulted the photograph he had brought, comparing the background landscape to what he could see from his position. The distant mountains matched, as did the particular arrangement of taller trees along the ridge. This was undoubtedly the correct location. But where was the chapel of St. Dymphna? Father Elias stepped out of his vehicle and approached the gate on foot. Beyond it, he could see the private road stretching into the forest, but there was no sign of the white chapel building. Instead, the area appeared to have been extensively landscaped, with ornamental trees and shrubs lining the entrance. Perplexed, he reached for his cell phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Harold Gibbons, the longtime caretaker of St. Dymphna. They hadn't spoken in years, but Father Elias hoped the man was still in the area and could provide some explanation. The phone rang several times before a rough voice answered. "Hello, Harold. This is Father Elias Morrow from St. Agnes in Eldon Hollow." There was a pause, then recognition. "Father Elias. It's been quite a while. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you," Father Elias replied, though it wasn't entirely true. "Harold, I'm standing at what I believe is the entrance to St. Dymphna, but the chapel seems to be gone." A longer pause this time. "That's right, Father. The diocese closed the chapel years ago. It was sold in 1982 to a man named Silas Redwood. He had it torn down." Father Elias felt a chill despite the warmth of the day. "I never heard anything about the chapel being sold, let alone demolished." "Well, after what happened with the nuns, attendance dropped off significantly. Then there was that incident with the bell tower cracking almost injured poor Thomas Farrell. The bishop decided it wasn't worth maintaining for such a small congregation." Father Elias found himself staring at the no trespassing sign with growing unease. "Is this Silas Redwood still the owner of the property?" "Oh yes," Harold confirmed. "He's got quite a spread back there. His main house is a bit farther in, near where the forest thickens. The chapel site is just part of his land now." "I see," said Father Elias slowly. "I was hoping to visit the chapel today for personal reasons. It's the anniversary, you know." Harold's voice softened with understanding. "Of course, it's been 28 years today, hasn't it? I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing, Father. Do you know if Mr. Redwood is generally open to visitors? Maybe if I explain the situation." "To be honest, he's not known for his hospitality," Harold replied cautiously. "He's something of a recluse, from what I've heard. Keeps to himself, doesn't mingle much with the locals." Father Elias sighed, the weight of disappointment settling heavily on his shoulders. "Well, thank you for the information, Harold. I appreciate it." "Listen, Father," Harold said, his tone brightening slightly. "I still live nearby, about 15 minutes from where you are now. I saved a few items from the chapel when it was shut down, the old altar cross, some prayer books, things like that. You're welcome to come by and see them if you'd like." "That's very kind of you," Father Elias replied. "Maybe I will. But first, I think I'd like to try speaking with Mr. Redwood. Do you know how I might get to his main house?" Harold hesitated. "Well, there's the private road you're looking at, but that gate is always locked. There's a public road that loops around, though it'll get you close enough to the property." After receiving directions from Harold, Father Elias thanked him and ended the call. He returned to his car, conflicted about his next move. Part of him felt he should respect Silas Redwood's privacy and head straight to Harold's house, but a stronger impulse pulled him toward the public road that would lead to Redwood's property. 20 minutes later, Father Elias found himself driving along a narrow path skirting the edge of what must have been Redwood's land. Through gaps in the trees, he caught glimpses of manicured grounds and eventually a substantial structure that looked more like a mountain lodge than a conventional home. The building was impressive 3 stories of natural stone and wood with expansive windows and multiple terraces overlooking the forest. It spoke of wealth that seemed out of place in the modest rural setting. Father Elias found a small parking area near what appeared to be a service entrance to the property. He parked his car, straightened his clerical collar, and approached the imposing residence with a mix of determination and apprehension. As he neared the main entrance, a stone path led him past carefully tended gardens and a small decorative pond. The craftsmanship of the place was undeniable. Yet Father Elias couldn't shake a sense of unease as he climbed the steps to the front door and knocked firmly on the heavy oak panel. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a tall, athletic man in his 60s, dressed in expensive workout clothes. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and in one hand, he held a leather dog leash. The man's expression shifted from neutral expectation to unmistakable displeasure as he registered Father Elias's clerical attire. "Yes?" he asked, not bothering to hide the impatience in his tone. "Good afternoon," said Father Elias with a warm smile. "Are you Mr. Silas Redwood?" The man's jaw tightened. "I am, and you're trespassing on private property. I apologize for coming unannounced. My name is Father Elias Morrow from St. Agnes of Mercy Church in Eldon Hollow." He extended his hand, but Silas Redwood made no move to take it. "What do you want?" Redwood demanded, his fingers tightening around the dog leash. Father Elias lowered his hand, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the hostility. "I was hoping I could have a few minutes of your time. You see, I visited the site where the chapel of St. Dymphna used to be, and I was surprised to find it no longer there. If you already saw it's not there, why are you bothering me?" Redwood snapped, his voice gaining an edge that was almost a growl. "I spoke with Harold Gibbons, the former caretaker. He mentioned that you had purchased the property. I just wanted to. What? Blame me for buying land that was for sale?" Redwood stepped forward aggressively, causing Father Elias to involuntarily take a step back. "Are you one of those who think that land is somehow sacred? The diocese didn't think so when they sold it." "No, no," said Father Elias quickly, raising his hands in a calming gesture. "I don't blame you at all. I was simply curious about the circumstances. The chapel held personal significance for me, and I didn't know it had been demolished." Redwood seemed momentarily appeased, though his expression remained cold. "Well, now you know. It's gone and good riddance. I sleep better now that I don't have to hear that bell ringing 3 times a day and giving me migraines." Father Elias couldn't help but respond. "The Angelus bell is a beautiful tradition, sir. It calls the faithful to recite the Lord's Prayer and honors the incarnation of God. It's meant to be a reminder of holy things, of our freedom from sin and death." "Oh, spare me the sermon," Redwood scoffed. "People can set alarms on their phones if they need a reminder to pray. They don't need to disturb the whole countryside with medieval noise pollution." Clearly, the conversation was not heading in a productive direction. Father Elias decided to try a different approach. "I understand that you value your privacy, Mr. Redwood, and I've intruded on your time. I apologize for that. Perhaps we could speak another day, when it's more convenient for you." "There will be no other day," Redwood said flatly. "I have no interest in discussing a building that hasn't existed in decades with a priest I've never met before. Now I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff and report you for trespassing." Father Elias nodded, recognizing the futility of continuing. "Very well. Thank you for your time, Mr. Redwood. Peace be with you." Redwood's only response was to shut the door firmly in his face. With a deep sigh, Father Elias turned and walked back down the stone path to his car. The encounter had left him feeling both disappointed and unsettled. There was something about Redwood's manner, beyond mere rudeness, that suggested a deeper antipathy toward the church and its representatives. As Father Elias reached his vehicle, he glanced back at the imposing house. Was it merely his imagination? Or was Redwood watching him from one of the upper windows? The feeling of being watched made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, torn between returning to Eldon Hollow and stopping by Harold Gibbons's house, as the man had invited him to do. Perhaps seeing some of the preserved items from Santa Dinfna would provide the closure he had been seeking by coming here today. As he drove away from Redwood's property, Father Elias found himself taking the road that passed near the old chapel site. He couldn't explain the compulsion. After all, he now knew there was nothing to see, yet something was drawing him back in that direction. The car rounded a curve, bringing into view the approximate location where Santa Dinfna had once stood. Through a gap in the trees, he could make out a clearing where the small building had been, now landscaped with ornamental shrubs. Suddenly, the car radio came to life, emitting a strange, haunting sound. Father Elias jumped, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The sound was unmistakable. Gregorian chant, the ancient and ethereal music of monastic worship. But the radio had been off. He clearly remembered turning it off when he left Eldon Hollow. Father Elias pulled the car to the side of the road and looked at the radio in puzzlement. The chant continued for several seconds, then faded away as abruptly as it had begun. What the hell? Component placement, he muttered, reaching out to touch the radio dial. He turned it on and then off again, but the mysterious chant did not return. Had he imagined it? A trick of a tired mind, perhaps, or some strange electrical malfunction in his aging vehicle. However, as he sat there, a peculiar feeling overcame him. The same feeling he had experienced earlier while looking at the photograph in his office. A tug at his heart, an inexplicable certainty that he was meant to be here now for a purpose he had yet to understand. The hairs on his arms stood on end, and a warmth spread through his ears. Physical sensations he had felt before during moments of intense prayer or spiritual insight. At the seminary, his spiritual director had taught him to recognize these as potential movements of the Holy Spirit. Once again, the faint chant emanated from the silent radio, and this time Father Elias was sure he was not imagining it. It was as if a supernatural voice was calling him, guiding him. Without fully understanding his own actions, Father Elias carefully made a U-turn and drove back toward the gate blocking access to the old chapel site. Whatever was happening, he felt compelled to investigate further, even if it meant risking another confrontation with the inhospitable Silas Redwood. Father Elias parked his car at the side of the road, near the gate marking the entrance to Silas Redwood's property. The no trespassing signs loomed before him, their warnings clear and unequivocal. He sat for a moment with his hands still on the wheel, questioning the wisdom of what he was contemplating. "Lord, guide my actions," he whispered. "If I am about to err in judgment, show me the right way." But the strange feeling of spiritual urging persisted, and after one last moment of hesitation, Father Elias stepped out of his vehicle and cautiously approached the gate, fully aware that he was considering trespassing a difficult act to reconcile with his moral duties as a priest. Yet the mysterious chant from his radio had awakened something in him, a conviction that transcended ordinary concerns. Instead of trying to get through the gate itself, Father Elias began walking along the fence perimeter, searching for a vantage point from which to observe the old chapel site. The fence was substantial, 8 feet of ornate but sturdy metal, yet it followed the contours of the uneven forest terrain, occasionally dipping closer to the ground where the earth rose beneath it. As he walked, Father Elias briefly closed his eyes, trying to visualize the layout of Santa Dinfna as it once had been. If his memory served him correctly, the wooden bench where the nuns had been photographed had been east of the chapel, near a large oak tree. Opening his eyes, he scanned the property. Beyond the fence, attempting to locate landmarks that might have survived the demolition. The oak was gone, presumably removed during Redwood's renovations, but a cluster of pines that had stood behind the chapel remained, providing a point of reference. Father Elias continued along the fence line, moving toward the area where he believed the chapel had stood. As he walked, his foot suddenly caught on an exposed tree root, causing him to stumble forward. He reached out his hands to steady himself, grabbing the metal fence, but the moment of his fall pressed his weight against a section where the fence posts were set in uneven ground. There was a loud cracking sound as the weakened fence joint gave way, creating a gap large enough for a person to slip through. Father Elias found himself sprawled partly on Redwood's property, the broken section of fence beneath him. "Oh my God," he murmured as he stood up and brushed dirt from his clothes. He had not intended to damage the fence, much less create a means of entry onto private property. Yet here he was, facing an unexpected opportunity or temptation. Father Elias looked back toward the road, making sure no one had witnessed his accidental vandalism. The area was deserted, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the afternoon breeze. He looked down at the broken fence, then to the clearing beyond where Santa Dymphna had once stood. "Forgive me," he whispered, making the sign of the cross before carefully passing through the gap in the fence. Once on Redwood's property, Father Elias moved quickly but cautiously toward the old chapel site. The area had been landscaped with non-native ornamental plants that looked out of place against the backdrop of the natural forest. Nothing remained to indicate that a place of worship had ever existed here, no foundation stones, no cross, no memorial of any kind. The absence struck Father Elias as particularly sad. It was as if Silas Redwood had deliberately erased every trace of the chapel's existence, removing not only the building but its very memory from the earth. As he contemplated this, a flash of reflected light caught his attention, something near the ground, partially hidden by decorative shrubs. Curious, Father Elias approached and pushed aside the branches to reveal a metal grate embedded in the earth. A ventilation grate of some kind. It looked old and worn. Its iron bars were rusted by time. Father Elias frowned in puzzlement. If the chapel had been completely demolished, why would an old ventilation grate remain? And why would a landscaped area without structures need ventilation at all? He crouched beside the grate, examining it more closely. The design was vintage, possibly dating from the 1930s or 40s, with ornate decorations around its edges. It seemed incongruous with the modern, minimalist aesthetic of Redwood's property. As he leaned in closer, a sound rose through the grate, so faint that at first Father Elias thought he had imagined it. But then came again a soft melodic humming, followed by what clearly sounded like a human cough. Father Elias's blood ran cold. The humming was reminiscent of the Gregorian chant he had heard on his car radio. But this was no electrical malfunction or product of his imagination. Someone was underground, beneath what had once been the chapel of Saint Dymphna. "Hello," he called softly through the grate, but the humming continued uninterrupted, suggesting that the person could not hear him from their subterranean location. Father Elias straightened up, his mind racing. The implications were unsettling because there must be an underground space beneath the old chapel site, and more importantly, who was down there? He looked around, half expecting to see Silas Redwood approaching with fury in his eyes, but the property remained quiet and apparently unguarded, at least in this section. The main house was hidden from view by a cluster of trees, and there were no visible security cameras nearby. Pulling his mobile phone from his pocket, Father Elias dialed 911, his hand trembling slightly as he raised the device to his ear. 911, what is your emergency? My name is Father Elias Morrow, he said, keeping his voice low despite the apparent solitude. I am on Silas Redwood's property, near the old site of St. Dymphna's Chapel, close to Route 37. I hesitate, he said suddenly, aware of how strange his report would sound. I believe someone might be trapped underground. I can hear singing and coughing coming from a ventilation grate. There was a brief silence on the other end. Sir, are you saying you suspect someone is being held against their will? I don't know, Father Elias admitted, but there definitely seems to be some kind of underground space and definitely someone down there. Given the remote location and the fact that this property is private, I am concerned. Are you on the property legally, sir? Asked the operator, skepticism entering her voice. Father Elias grimaced. I accidentally damaged a section of the fence and found myself on the property. I realize I am trespassing, but this seemed like an emergency situation. Do you understand your exact location on the property? Father Elias described his position as best he could, explaining that he was near where St. Dymphna's chapel once stood. "We will send officers to investigate," the operator assured him. "Please stay where you are until they arrive, unless you feel you are in danger." "Thank you," Father Elias replied, relieved. "I'll wait by my vehicle, which is parked on the side of the road near the main gate." After ending the call, Father Elias took one last look at the mysterious ventilation grate. The humming had stopped, but as he listened carefully, he could still hear occasional sounds of movement from below. Definitely, someone was down there, and the thought sent a chill down his spine. He headed back to the broken section of the fence, carefully slipped through the gap, and returned to the public road. As he walked toward his parked car, he dialed Harold Gibbons' number, feeling an urgent need to gather more information before the police arrived. "Harold, it's Father Elias again. I need to ask you something important. When St. Dymphna was still standing, was there any kind of basement or underground room beneath it?" Harold sounded surprised by the question. "No, Father. The chapel was built on a simple concrete slab. No basement, no crypt, none of that." "Why do you ask?" Father Elias explained what he had discovered: the ventilation grate and the sounds coming from underground. "That's impossible," Harold said firmly. "There was never any underground structure at St. Dymphna. I owned that property for 20 years. I would know. So the only explanation is that someone built it after the chapel was demolished," Father Elias concluded, "when Silas Redwood took possession." "That's disturbing," Harold admitted. "What are you going to do?" "I've already called the police. They're sending officers to investigate." "I'll come too," Harold decided. "I know that property better than anyone. I can be there in 10 minutes. Father Elias thanked him and ended the call. Then he settled into his car to wait, running his fingers over the beads of his rosary and murmuring prayers for whoever might be trapped underground where St. Dymphna had once stood. Father Elias sat in his parked car, his fingers moving methodically over the smooth beads of his rosary as he recited familiar prayers. The ritual brought a measure of calm to his troubled mind. Although questions continued swirling beneath the surface of his concentration, who could possibly be underground at the old chapel site? What purpose could an underground chamber serve in such a remote location? And most unsettling of all, could there be any connection with the disappearance of the 4 nuns 28 years ago? The last question seemed outrageous even to Father Elias. 28 years was an impossibly long time for someone to remain hidden. However, the timing of his discovery on the very anniversary of the disappearance seemed more than mere coincidence. A vehicle approaching from the direction of the town interrupted his thoughts. It was a beaten-up pickup truck that Father Elias recognized as belonging to Harold Gibbons. The former caretaker stopped behind his sedan and got out of the cab, his weathered face etched with concern. Father Elias called out as he approached. "Any sign of the police?" "Not yet. Not yet," Father Elias replied, stepping out to greet him. "Thanks for coming so quickly." Harold's eyes scanned the road and the gate entrance to the Redwood property. "I've been thinking about what you told me. It doesn't make sense. If Redwood built something underground where the chapel was, people would have noticed the construction." "Not necessarily. You can't dig a basement without heavy equipment. Unless it was done gradually over time," suggested Father Elias. "Or maybe there was already some natural cavity in the ground that he expanded." Harold shook his head doubtfully. "This area doesn't have caves or anything like that. It's mostly solid rock beneath a few feet of soil." Before they could speculate further, the distinctive sound of sirens approaching reached them. A patrol car rounded the curve with flashing lights, but the siren faded as it stopped in front of Father Elias's car. 2 officers emerged, one older with gray hair at the temples, the other younger and lean with a sharpness in his movements that suggested military experience. Their badges identified them as officers from the Shasta County Sheriff's Department. "Father Moros, Renia?" 36.28 minutes, the senior officer asked, approaching with professional but not hostile demeanor. "Yes, officer. Thank you for coming." Father Elias gestured to his companion. "This is Harold Gibbons, the former caretaker of St. Dymphna Chapel, which once stood on this property." The senior officer nodded in recognition. "I'm Officer Williams, and this is Officer Reynolds." The dispatch said you reported hearing sounds coming from an underground location on private property. Can you explain exactly what you discovered? Father Elias explained the circumstances that had brought him to the area, his accidental trespassing through the fence, and the discovery of the ventilation grate with sounds emanating from below. He was careful to emphasize his remorse over the trespassing, which Officer Williams acknowledged with a slight hand gesture. Let's focus first on the potential welfare issue, the officer said. If someone is indeed trapped or being held against their will, that takes priority over a minor trespassing incident. Harold interjected. I maintained St. Dymphna for over 20 years before it was sold. There was never any underground structure associated with the chapel. Whatever is there now was built after Silas Redwood took possession. The younger officer, Officer Reynolds, who had been silently taking notes, looked up. Mr. Redwood is a prominent landowner in these parts. These are serious implications. I understand that, said Father Elias solemnly. I am not accusing Mr. Redwood of anything. I'm simply reporting what I heard and expressing concern for whoever might be down there. Officer Williams nodded thoughtfully. Right? Let's take a look at this ventilation grate you discovered, Mr. Gibbons, since you're familiar with the property. Would you mind accompanying us? Not at all, Harold agreed. The four men walked toward the damaged section of the fence. Father Elias pointed to the gap he had inadvertently created, and carefully they made their way through it onto Redwood's property. Father Elias led them to the ornamental bushes that partially concealed the ventilation grate. Here it is, he said, pushing aside the branches to reveal the rusted grate. Officer Williams crouched beside it, examining the vent with an experienced eye. This is old craftsmanship. It doesn't match the modern landscaping at all. Officer Reynolds joined him, shining a flashlight through the grate. You can't see much. The shaft veers after about 6 feet. Listen, urged Father Elias. Just stay silent for a moment. The four men fell quiet, straining to hear any sounds from below. For nearly a minute there was nothing but the ambient noise of the forest birds calling, leaves whispering. Father Elias began to worry that whoever had been down there had moved away from the vent or had fallen silent upon hearing voices above. Then, faint but distinct, a woman's voice began humming. The melody was haunting, archaic, a snippet of sacred music that Father Elias recognized instantly despite its broken, wavering quality. Salve Regina, whispered Officer Williams, a flash of recognition crossing his weathered features. Harold nodded in confirmation. Yes, the Marian antiphon, sung in monasteries and convents for centuries. The humming continued for several more seconds. Then it faded, replaced by the sound of labored breathing and a dry, rasping cough. The officers exchanged meaningful looks. Officer Reynolds straightened up, his expression now grave. There's definitely someone down there, and from that cough, they may need medical attention. We need to speak with Mr. Redwood immediately, Officer Williams decided. This is at least a welfare check now. I don't understand, said Harold, shaking his head in puzzlement. This ventilation grate wasn't here when the chapel was standing, and there was never any basement or underground room. How could someone be down there? That's what we intend to find out, Officer Williams replied, his tone shifting fully into investigative mode. Let's go to the Redwood residence. The four men returned to the road and their respective vehicles. Following the officer's patrol car, Father Elias and Harold drove the short distance to Silas Redwood's main house. The imposing structure seemed more intimidating than ever as they approached, its many windows like watchful eyes observing their arrival. Officer Williams instructed Father Elias and Harold to remain by their vehicles while he and Officer Reynolds approached the front door. Father Elias watched as the officers knocked and waited, the tension in their postures evident despite their professional demeanor. Several moments passed before the door opened, but it was not Silas Redwood who appeared. Instead, the group saw him approaching from the rear of the property, still dressed in his workout clothes and carrying a large German shepherd on a leash. His expression quickly shifted from polite inquiry to barely contained fury when he saw Father Elias and Harold standing near the officer's cruiser. What is the meaning of this? Redwood demanded as he reached the front steps. Because these intruders are on my property again. Officer Williams introduced himself and his partner, explaining the purpose of their visit. In measured tones, we received a report of sounds coming from what appears to be an underground structure on the old chapel site. We would like to ask you some questions about that, sir. Redwood's face flushed with anger. This is outrageous. First, this priest shows up uninvited, trespasses through my fence and onto my land, and now he's making wild accusations and wasting police resources. No one is making accusations, Mr. Redwood, Officer Reynolds said calmly. We are simply following up on a welfare concern. Someone appears to be in an underground space on your property, and they sound like they may need medical attention. That's absurd, Redwood spat. There is no one on my property except me and my dogs. Would you know if someone was living in a what? A secret underground bunker. Do you realize how ridiculous that sounds? Nevertheless, sir, we are obligated to investigate, Officer Williams said firmly. We would like permission to search your house and grounds, including any basement areas. Absolutely not. Redwood's hand tightened on the dog's leash, causing the animal to shift restlessly. This is private property. You have no right to search without a warrant. Mr. Redwood, Officer Reynolds began, his tone reasonable but insistent. If there is someone in distress on your property, even an intruder you are unaware of, wouldn't you want to know? It could be a squatter who found their way into some old structure you don't even know exists. Redwood's eyes narrowed suspiciously. There are no old structures I don't know about. I've owned this land for over 25 years. I know every inch of it. So what about the ventilation grate near the old chapel site? Officer Williams asked. The one that appears to ventilate an underground space. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Redwood's expression, a momentary hesitation that Father Elias caught before the man's face hardened once again into stubborn denial. I installed a drainage system when landscaping the area, Redwood said dismissively. What you call a ventilation grate is probably just a decorative grate covering a drainage pipe. There's nothing sinister about it. A drainage system doesn't sing hymns or cough, Mr. Redwood, Officer Williams remarked dryly. Redwood turned his gaze toward Father Elias. This man clearly orchestrated this whole situation. He probably brought some device that plays recorded sounds and planted it near the drain. He's harassing me because he's upset that I bought church property. I would never do such a thing, Father Elias protested, making the sign of the cross. As God is my witness, I heard a woman's voice coming from that grate. We all heard her a moment ago. Redwood sneered. A priest invoking God while trespassing and lying. How typical. That's enough, Mr. Redwood, Officer Williams said sternly. We are asking for your voluntary cooperation. If you refuse, we will have no choice but to pursue other legal avenues. Then pursue them, Redwood replied coldly. In the meantime, I want these people off my property immediately. If they're not gone in 2 minutes, I will press trespassing charges against all of you. Acknowledging the stalemate, Officer Williams nodded to Father Elias and Harold, indicating they should return to their vehicles. The officers walked back to their cruiser with measured steps that suggested this retreat was strategic rather than final. Arriving at the police car, Officer Williams spoke quietly with Father Elias. Don't worry, Father. This isn't over. I'm going to contact dispatch and request information on the property deed, ownership history, and any prior complaints or incidents at this location. I also want to check the files on those missing nuns from 1980. Something isn't right here. Father Elias nodded gratefully. Thank you, officer. I know how strange this must seem, but I really believe someone needs help down there. I believe you. We all heard something, the officer replied. If it's exactly what you think, we'll find out with a proper investigation. For now, go back to Harold's house. We'll be in touch. The drive to Harold's house was brief but tense. Both men lost in thought about the mysterious voice beneath the old chapel grounds. Harold's house turned out to be a modest cabin set back from the main road, surrounded by towering pines casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. It's not much, but it's home, Harold said as he led Father Elias inside. The interior was simply furnished but comfortable, with well-used furniture and walls. decorated with fishing memorabilia and some framed photographs. It's very cozy, Father Elias responded sincerely, noticing the cross hanging prominently above the stone fireplace. Harold busied himself in the small kitchen preparing tea while Father Elias settled into an armchair. I kept several items from Santa Dinfna when it was closed, Harold called over his shoulder. They're in a trunk in the guest room. I'll show them to you after we've had our tea. Father Elias nodded, his mind still troubled by the ventilation grate and the haunting voice that had come from it. Harold, why do you think the diocese never informed me about the sale of the chapel? I was at Santa Ynez all those years ago, and my sister was among the missing nuns. Surely someone should have consulted me. Harold returned with 2 steaming cups, handing one to Father Elias before taking a seat. Opposite him, the decision came from the bishop's office in Sacramento. I don't think it was handled well. To be honest, after what happened with the nuns, attendance dropped significantly. Then there was that incident with the bell tower. What exactly happened? Father Elias asked, gratefully sipping the hot tea. Structural failure, Harold explained. The chapel was built in the 1920s, and maintenance had been minimal. One Sunday morning in 1981, the bell tower developed a large crack. The old bell, which must have weighed 300 pounds, came crashing down. It nearly killed poor Thomas Farrell, who was covering as caretaker while I was laid up with a broken leg. Did anyone get hurt? By the grace of God, no. But it was the last straw for the diocese. They declared the building unsafe and closed it immediately. By early 1982, they had decided to shut it down completely instead of paying for repairs. Father Elias frowned. And Silas Redwood bought it shortly after? That's right. He paid cash, from what I heard, more than the land was worth, which raised some eyebrows. But the diocese needed funds for renovations on the cathedral, so they didn't ask questions. What did Redwood do with the property immediately after the purchase? Harold's brow furrowed as he recalled. He demolished the chapel immediately. He had a crew there within days. There were some protests from locals who thought the building could have been saved, but legally there was nothing they could do. After that, he started landscaping the grounds but never built anything substantial on the chapel site itself. Did you notice any unusual construction activity? Anything that might suggest he was building something underground? Nothing obvious, Harold replied. Then he paused. Although there was a period in 1983 when people reported hearing strange noises at night, machinery running, that kind of thing. And some people complained of tremors. Father Elias leaned forward, his interest piqued. Tremors like earthquakes? That's what the authorities concluded. Minor seismic activity, but it seemed strange that it was localized in that specific area. Some wondered if Redwood was doing some kind of excavation work, but no one investigated further. Harold shrugged. An officer came, looked around, found nothing suspicious, and that was that. Redwood has always been, well, connected. He donates to the right causes, knows the right people. The conversation drifted to other topics: changes in Eldon Hollow over the years, the decline of the congregation at Santa Ynez, and theological discussions reflecting the deep faith of both men. Time passed quickly, and Father Elias was surprised when his phone rang, breaking the comfortable rhythm of their conversation. Father speaking, he answered. Father, this is Officer Williams. The officer's voice sounded energized, determined. I've made some progress. I spoke with Judge Martinez, who is sympathetic to our concerns. She has granted an emergency order for a welfare check based on reasonable suspicion of unlawful confinement. Father Elias felt a surge of hope. That's excellent news, officer. We'll head back to Redwood's property within the hour. I wanted to let you know, although I must advise you to stay away for safety reasons. This is now an official police operation. I understand, Father Elias replied, though his desire to be present was strong. But, officer, if you find anything or anyone, I will be the first civilian you call, Williams promised. This whole situation started because of your persistence, Father. I respect that. After Harold overheard the conversation, he insisted that they at least be allowed to observe from a distance, arguing that their spiritual presence might be important if something significant was discovered. With some reluctance, Officer Williams agreed that they could remain in their vehicle at a safe distance, but strictly as observers. An hour later, Father Elias and Harold parked along the public road near the entrance to Redwood's property. From their position, they could see multiple police vehicles arriving, including a forensic van and an ambulance waiting nearby, a precaution that sent a chill down Father Elias's spine. Officer Williams briefly approached their car. "We're going in with the warrant. I've set my body camera to stream to this channel." He showed them how to access the stream on Father Elias's phone. "You can watch from here, but do not approach under any circumstances." "Understood?" Both men nodded in agreement, and Officer Williams returned to his colleagues. They watched through the phone screen as the assembled officers approached Redwood's front door, warrant in hand. They saw Redwood answer the door, his face contorting with rage at the sight of the officers and the document they presented. The audio was muffled but clear enough to hear him protest vehemently, threatening lawsuits and calls to his lawyer. Despite his objections, the officers executed the search warrant, methodically examining the main house while Redwood was kept under watch in his living room. After approximately 45 minutes, Officer Williams reported via body camera that the house and conventional basement revealed nothing suspicious. Now moving to the forest path and outbuildings, Williams narrated for the benefit of those monitoring the stream. "Mr. Redwood has confirmed there is a storage shed along the private path connecting his main house to the old chapel site." Father Elias and Harold watched intently as the officers, accompanied by a visibly furious Redwood, made their way down the forest path. The trail was well maintained but narrow, winding between ancient trees that created a tunnel-like effect in the fading daylight. After about 15 minutes of walking, the camera revealed a modest wooden structure, the storage shed Redwood had mentioned. It was larger than Father Elias had expected, perhaps 20 square feet, with worn siding and a metal roof. "It's just a tool shed," Redwood could be heard saying. "Garden equipment, maintenance, supplies, that kind of thing. Complete waste of your time." The officers methodically searched the building, which indeed contained an assortment of tools, gardening equipment, and landscaping supplies. The space was dusty and appeared little used, with cobwebs in the corners and a damp smell that one of the officers remarked on. As the search was nearing completion, there was a sudden noise. One of the officers had dropped a heavy wrench that landed on the wooden floor with an unexpectedly hollow sound. The camera tilted downward to show Officer Reynolds kneeling and tapping experimentally on the floorboards. "This section sounds different," he observed, pulling out his flashlight to examine the area more closely. "These boards seem newer than the others." Despite Redwood's renewed protests, the officers began removing the suspicious boards. Beneath them, they discovered a stone staircase descending into darkness. "Mr. Redwood," Officer Williams said, his voice transmitting clearly through the body camera microphone, "would you care to explain this?" Redwood's face had turned pale, his earlier bluster replaced by tense silence. When he refused to comment, Williams instructed several officers to stay with him while he and Officer Reynolds prepared to descend the staircase. "Switching to tactical lights," narrated Williams as he activated a powerful flashlight. "We are proceeding into the underground passage." The camera showed a narrow stone staircase that appeared to have been carved directly into the bedrock. The steps were worn in the center, suggesting regular use over a period of years. At the foot of the stairs, a heavy wooden door blocked further progress. "Locked," reported Reynolds, examining the old iron mechanism. "Mr. Redwood, we need the key to this door." From above, Redwood's voice called out, still defiant. "I don't know anything about any door. This must have been here when I bought the property." The officers exchanged skeptical looks, and Williams instructed his colleagues to search for a key. One of them noticed a small recess in the wall next to the staircase, partially hidden by shadow. Inside was an iron key, green with age but apparently functional. "I found a key," reported the officer, handing it to Williams. The officer inserted the key into the lock, which turned with a loud metallic creak. The door swung inward, revealing a dark tunnel beyond. "We are entering what appears to be a man-made tunnel," narrated Williams, his voice now quiet and tense. "About 6 feet high, 3 feet wide. The walls are stone and earth, supported by wooden beams at regular intervals. Evidence of relatively recent construction, despite attempts to make it look older. The officers proceeded cautiously through the tunnel, which extended for what seemed like several hundred feet. The passage curved slightly, and Father Elias suddenly realized with a start that it must lead toward the old chapel site. After several minutes of walking, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. The camera's light revealed rudimentary furniture, a thin mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, a small table with the remains of what appeared to be food. And then from the shadows came a whispered voice. "Help! Is anyone there?" Officer Williams directed his light toward the sound, and the camera revealed a frail, elderly woman lying on the mattress. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken but alert. Her gray hair was cut very short, and she held what appeared to be a hand-carved wooden rosary. "Ma'am," Williams said gently, approaching slowly to avoid frightening her. "I'm Officer Williams from the Shasta County Sheriff's Department. We're here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's cracked lips moved, forming words with visible effort. "Sister Teresa. Teresa Morrow." In Harold's car, Father Elias gasped, his hand flying to his mouth. Tears welled in his eyes. As he whispered, "My sister. It's my sister." Harold placed a steadying hand on his arm, his own expression one of shock and disbelief. Through the body camera, they could see that the small chamber was lined with religious carvings, crosses, saints, biblical scenes, all apparently created from scraps of wood and stone. A single candle sat on the makeshift table, long since extinguished. On one wall, a large cross had been meticulously etched into the stone. "Sister Teresa," Officer Williams said, his voice professional but kind. "We're going to get you medical attention right away. Can you tell me if there is anyone else down here with you?" The woman's gaze shifted to a dark corner of the chamber where the camera's light had yet to reach. "Beatrice," she whispered, "but she's been with God for many years." The camera focused to reveal what appeared to be human remains, a skeleton lying on a similar mattress, partially covered with a threadbare blanket. "We need the medical team down here immediately," Williams said into his radio, his voice tense but controlled. "And notify the forensic unit that we also have human remains." Unable to hold back any longer, Father Elias bolted from the car, ignoring Harold's protests. He ran toward the police perimeter where an officer tried to intercept him. "Please," Father Elias pleaded. "That is my sister you found. I am Father Elias Morrow. She has been missing for 28 years. I must see her." The officer, recognizing the name from the earlier report, spoke into his radio. After a brief consultation, he escorted Father Elias through the perimeter to where the forensic team and paramedics were preparing to enter the tunnel. "Wait here, Father," the officer instructed. "They will bring her out soon." Time seemed to stretch as Father Elias waited, alternating between praying and trying to process the reality of what was happening. After what felt like an eternity, activity increased at the shed's entrance. Officers emerged, followed by paramedics carefully, carrying a stretcher. On it lay Sister Teresa, so thin and fragile she barely made a shape beneath the blanket covering her. As they passed where Father Elias stood, her head turned slightly and their eyes met. Despite the ravages of time and suffering, he recognized his sister in those eyes. That once shone with youthful devotion, now wells of unfathomable experience. Her lips moved, and though no sound emerged, Father Elias could read the words she formed. "God never abandoned me." As the paramedics hurried her to the waiting ambulance, another group emerged from the shed carrying a body bag. The remains of Sister Beatrice, Father Elias presumed. The sight sent a fresh wave of pain through him, tempered by the miracle of his sister's survival. Amid the commotion, he saw Silas Redwood being led away in handcuffs, the man's previous arrogance replaced by a dark, defeated expression. As Redwood passed by where Father Elias stood, he suddenly lunged forward and spat directly at the priest, the spit landing on his cheek. "Proud of yourself, Father," Redwood sneered before officers pulled him back. Father Elias calmly wiped his face, his voice steady as he replied, I count it as joy to suffer as my Lord did." As Redwood was taken away, Father Elias overheard fragments of conversation among officers discussing what they had found. One officer mentioned the discovery of a second set of skeletal remains in another chamber, speculating that they might be the remains of Sister Beatrice, who had been about the same age as Terry's when she disappeared. Harold appeared beside Father Elias, having followed at a more cautious pace. "The ambulance is ready to leave," he said softly. "We should follow them to the hospital." Father Elias nodded, his heart too full for words. Together they returned to Harold's car and followed the ambulance as it sped away from Silas Redwood's property, sirens wailing, carrying the miraculous survivor of a 28-year nightmare toward the light of freedom at last. The emergency entrance lights cast harsh shadows across the ambulance area as paramedics carried Sister Teresa through the sliding doors. Father Elias and Harold arrived moments later, parking hurriedly and rushing to the entrance, only to be stopped by hospital staff. "I'm sorry, Father," said a nurse firmly but compassionately. "You can't go with her right now. The medical team needs space to work. She is in an extremely fragile condition." "I understand," Father Elias replied, though every fiber of his being longed to stay by his sister's side. "But I am her only living family. She's been missing for 28 years. I thought she was dead until today." The nurse's expression softened. "The doctors will do everything they can for her. There's a waiting room just down that hall. I promise someone will come to speak with you as soon as possible." Reluctantly, Father Elias allowed Harold to guide him to the waiting room, a sterile space with uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines. The two men sat in silence for several minutes, the magnitude of the day's events too overwhelming for casual conversation. Finally, Harold spoke. "It's a miracle, Father, after all these years, to find her alive." "A miracle, indeed," Father Elias agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Although I fear what she must have endured to survive." "She had her faith," Harold said simply. "Sometimes that's enough." Father Elias nodded, drawing comfort from the thought. He remembered the religious carvings that had lined the underground chamber, evidence that even in the darkest captivity, his sister had maintained her devotion to God. "I should call St. Agnes," he suddenly realized. The congregation should know she had been found. As he reached for his phone, it rang in his hand. The screen displayed Officer Williams' number. "Officer," Father Elias answered. "I'm at the hospital. My sister is being treated now." "I'm glad to hear that, Father," Williams replied. "I'm calling to update you on the investigation. We have Silas Redwood secured in custody, but he refuses to speak without his lawyer present. However, we found something significant during a more thorough search of his house, a diary. It appears he has been keeping detailed records for decades." Father Elias felt a chill. "What kind of records?" "It's disturbing content, Father. The diary contains extensive writings about his hatred toward the Catholic Church and women religious in particular. There are entries dating back to the late 1970s describing his obsession with the nuns of St. Dymphna." "But why?" Father Elias asked, struggling to understand the depth of hatred required to commit such crimes. What possible motivation could he have had? There was a brief hesitation before Williams continued. "According to his writings, Redwood's mother abandoned him as a baby, leaving him with his grandmother. She later became a nun. He never knew her, never even saw her. His grandmother, who raised him, was apparently a strict Catholic who physically abused him in the name of religious discipline. He developed a pathological hatred toward nuns in particular, seeing them as women who abandoned their natural duties toward families." Father Elias closed his eyes. A wave of sadness washed over him. "So much brokenness," he murmured. "Such a twisted thought." "There's more, Father," Williams continued, his voice somber. "The diary details what happened to the other nuns. The two older sisters, Mildred Hayes and Joan Keller, apparently died within the first year of captivity. Given their age and the conditions in which they were kept, it's not surprising their souls rest in peace," Father Elias whispered, crossing himself. "Sister Beatrice survived longer, almost a decade according to Redwood's entries. She died in the early 1990s, apparently from an untreated respiratory infection. And my sister, how did she survive when the others did not? Williams hesitated again. Father, there are aspects of Redwood's diary that are particularly distressing. It seems he developed an obsession with Sister Teresa. He kept her separate from the others, especially after Sister Beatrice's death. There are photographs in the diary suggesting he subjected her to degrading treatment. Father Elias gasped as a wave of nausea rose in his throat. My God, I'm sorry, Father. The evidence indicates he was physically and psychologically abusive toward her for years. It's remarkable she maintained her sanity under such conditions. My sister did not sin, Father Elias said firmly, both to himself and to the officer. She was a victim. The sin belongs entirely to her captor. Of course, Father, Williams agreed solemnly. No one would suggest otherwise. Harold, who had been listening from Father Elias's side of the conversation, placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. There is one more thing you should know, Williams continued. The diary details how he managed to kidnap 4 nuns without anyone finding out. It was a meticulously planned operation. Redwood had been watching St. Dymphna for months, learning the nuns' routines. When he learned they would be alone during their retreat, he saw his chance. How did he take her without leaving evidence? Father Elias asked, recalling how the investigation had been hindered by the complete lack of signs of struggle or forced entry. According to his writings, he pretended to be a friendly neighbor bringing tea and supplies to the chapel. The tea was drugged. The 2 older nuns drank it and became drowsy. When the younger nuns helped them lie down, Redwood entered and overpowered them one by one. He started with the older nuns, who were fragile and easier to subdue. Your sister almost escaped. She fought and nearly reached the door, but he knocked her unconscious and then drugged her too. Father Elias shuddered, imagining his sister's terror. He took her through a service corridor in the old chapel, loading them into his vehicle during the night. Then he meticulously cleaned the chapel, burning all evidence, their bags, letters, bedding. He even scrubbed the floors with bleach to destroy any traces. By the time the alarm was raised, there was nothing left to find. And the police investigation? Swing. Father Elias asked, recalling the frustration and helplessness he had felt during those first weeks. Rural investigations in 1980 were not what they are today, Williams explained. Resources were limited, forensic techniques were less advanced, and record-keeping was irregular at best. Once the initial searches turned up nothing, the case quickly went cold. Redwood himself was never considered a suspect. He was wealthy, respected in the community, had no criminal record, and later bought the chapel through a shell company. Father Elias concluded, piecing it together. He demolished it to ensure no one would search there again. Exactly. After buying the property, he built the underground chambers and tunnel, connecting them to his storage shed. That explains the reports of nighttime construction noises and tremors in 1983. How could no one have noticed? Harold interjected, his voice rising with indignation. Father Elias passed the question to Williams, who sighed audibly. It's not something I'm proud to report, but Redwood's diary suggests he bribed certain officials to ignore complaints and look the other way during construction. We will investigate those allegations thoroughly. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a doctor in surgical scrubs who approached, holding a clipboard. Are you Father Morrow, the brother of Sister Teresa? Father Elias quickly ended his call with Officer Williams, promising to speak again soon, and turned to the doctor. Yes, that's me. How is my sister? The doctor, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes but a serious expression, took a seat in front of them. I am Dr. Chun. Your sister is in stable condition, but I want to be frank with you. Her health is extremely compromised. She is severely malnourished, has significant muscle atrophy, vitamin D deficiency due to lack of sunlight, and shows signs of healed fractures that were never properly treated. Father Elias nodded, trying to absorb the clinical assessment of his sister's suffering. The most immediate concern is reintroducing her to normal environmental conditions, Dr. Chun continued. After decades underground, her immune system is severely compromised. We need to be careful about potential infections, and her eyes will be sensitive to normal light levels for some time. When can I see her? Father Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She is being admitted to the ICU now, Dr. Chen replied. We need to be extremely cautious. With visits, anyone who enters must wear protective gear, mask, gown, gloves to minimize the risk of introducing pathogens. Even with these precautions, I can only allow very brief visits initially. I understand, said Father Elias, though the prospect of more delay was distressing. I have waited 28 years. I can wait a few more hours to ensure her safety. Dr. Chen smiled gently. She asked about you. Do you know? One of the first things she said was your name. I knew you would find her eventually. Tears welled up in Father Elias's eyes at this revelation. She never lost faith. Apparently not, agreed Dr. Chen. Paramedics reported she was clutching a rosary made of what appeared to be scraps of wood and threads of fabric. She refused to let it be taken from her even during treatment. That sounds like Teresa, said Father Elias, a sad smile crossing his face. Her faith was always stronger than mine, even when we were children. You'll be able to see her in about an hour, promised Dr. Chen, standing up. A nurse will come to get you when she's ready for visitors. When the doctor left, Father Elias turned to Harold. Would you mind if I spent some time in the chapel? I need to pray. Of course, replied Harold. I'll wait here in case there's any news. Father Elias made his way to the hospital's small chapel, a modest space designed to accommodate several religions. Finding it empty, he knelt before the simple altar and bowed his head. Thank you, Lord, for this miracle, he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. Thank you for preserving my sister through her terrible ordeal. Thank you for guiding me to her after all these years. He continued in silent prayer for some time, wrestling with the complex emotions rising within him: joy at finding his sister, pain for her suffering, anger at her captor, and persistent questions about why God had allowed such evil to persist for so long. Eventually, a sense of peace settled over him. The mysteries of God's ways remained, but Father Elias found himself accepting that some questions might never have satisfying answers in this life. What mattered now was that his sister had been found, and somehow, through unimaginable darkness, her faith had endured. When he returned to the waiting room, Harold was talking with a nurse who had come to escort Father Elias to the ICU. After putting on the required protective gear, he followed the nurse through a series of doors to a private room where his sister lay surrounded by medical equipment. The figure in the bed barely resembled the vibrant young woman who had disappeared 28 years ago. Sister Teresa's face was gaunt, her skin pale from decades without sunlight. Yet when her eyes opened and met his, Father Elias immediately recognized the inner light that had always defined his sister, a spiritual radiance that not even the darkest captivity had managed to extinguish. Elias, she whispered, her voice thin but clear. Did you find me, Teresa? He replied, tears running beneath his protective mask as he gently took her fragile hand in his gloved one. I never stopped searching, never stopped praying. A shadow of a smile touched her cracked lips. I knew you wouldn't. I told Beatrice God would send you to us someday. I'm sorry it took so long, said Father Elias, his voice breaking. Sister Teresa shook her head. God's timing is perfect, always perfect. The nurse touched Father Elias's shoulder, indicating his visit needed to end. He nodded, understandingly. I'll be right outside, he promised his sister. I won't leave the hospital. We have so much to talk about when you're stronger. Tell me one thing, Sister Teresa whispered as he prepared to leave. The church is still strong. Father Elias smiled beneath his mask. The gates of hell have not prevailed against it, he assured her, quoting Christ's promise in the Gospel of Matthew. Rest now, sister. God is with you, and so am I. As he left the room, Father Elias felt a deep sense of awe at his sister's first concern being for the church rather than for herself. Despite all she had endured, her priorities remained firmly aligned with her vocation. It was a testament to a faith that transcended circumstances, a faith that had sustained her through 28 years of darkness and would now guide her return to the light. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell to watch more fascinating stories. Have a great day.